Welcome to Serial Killer Files by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving deep into one of the most chilling and complex criminal cases in modern American history. Picture this. It's July 15th, 1997, Miami Beach. The morning sun casts long shadows across Ocean Drive as one of the world's most celebrated fashion designers steps out to collect his morning newspapers. In mere moments, 2 gunshots will shatter not just the tranquility of that morning, but send shockwaves around the globe. But our story doesn't begin there. It begins with a question that haunted investigators, psychologists, and the American public for months. Who was Andrew Cunanan? Born to a Filipino father and Italian mother, Andrew Cunanan was a living contradiction wrapped in designer clothes. Blessed with sharp intellect and striking good looks, he possessed the kind of quick wit that could captivate any room he entered. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a man in perpetual crisis, caught between worlds, identities, and ultimately between sanity and chaos. From his earliest years, Cunanan was burdened by immense familial expectations as the youngest child. These pressures forged him into something both fascinating and terrifying, a master of reinvention. He didn't just tell lies, he became them. Andrew De Silva one night, David Morales the next. Each identity came complete with distinct wardrobes, accents, and elaborate backstories so convincing that people who met him on consecutive evenings believed they'd encountered entirely different individuals. This wasn't mere teenage rebellion or harmless role-playing. By age 15, Cunanan was already infiltrating San Diego's gay bar scene, carefully grooming himself to appear worldly and sophisticated, far beyond his years. He had discovered something that would define the rest of his short life. In certain circles, beauty, youth, and intellect were currency. And Andrew Cunanan was about to become very wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. Let's pause here and really examine the mechanics of Cunanan's deception, because what he accomplished was nothing short of masterful psychological manipulation. This wasn't a con artist working street corners. This was a sophisticated operator who understood the deepest human desires for connection, status, and fantasy. Cunanan recognized that his ethnicity could be both an asset and a liability, depending on his audience. So he learned to weaponize every aspect of his identity, sometimes concealing his mixed heritage, other times emphasizing it. Each fabricated persona was deliberately crafted to captivate specific audiences, designed to secure access, admiration, and ultimately control. Within the affluent gay social circles of Southern California, Cunanan quickly identified what people valued: sophistication, cultural knowledge, and charm. He became fluent in the language of high society. He could discuss the histories of grandiose architecture, drop the names of esteemed designers, and navigate conversations about art and fashion with genuine expertise. This wasn't superficial name-dropping. Cunanan actually absorbed this knowledge, making himself genuinely valuable as a companion. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. These relationships weren't built on mutual affection or genuine connection. They were transactions. Charm became Cunanan's primary means of acquisition. His extravagant lifestyle, far beyond any legitimate means, was entirely financed by the generosity of older, wealthier men who were willing to provide credit cards, lavish meals, designer clothes, even luxury vehicles in exchange for his companionship. Cunanan had essentially created a business model out of being whoever people wanted him to be. The problem with living as a professional chameleon is that eventually you lose track of who you actually are underneath all the personas. And when that foundation crumbles, when the lies become too complex to maintain, when the benefactors begin to question or withdraw their support, what happens then? By the mid-1990s, Andrew Cunanan was living what appeared to be a dream life. He moved seamlessly through sophisticated scenes of art, fashion, and high society gatherings. He appeared at parties alongside celebrities and influential professionals, maintaining the elaborate charade of belonging. He was the young man who seemed to have everything: looks, intelligence, connections, and access to a world most people only glimpsed in magazines. But appearances, as we know, can be devastatingly deceptive. Beneath this carefully constructed veneer lay a man increasingly defined by contradictions. A lover of luxury who actually owned nothing, a social butterfly whose closest relationships were fundamentally transactional, a performer whose stage never allowed him to rest. The pressure of maintaining multiple identities began taking its toll. Cunanan's substance abuse issues, particularly with crystal methamphetamine and cocaine, weren't just recreational indulgences. They were escape mechanisms from an increasingly unsustainable existence. These drugs didn't just cloud his judgment. They amplified the paranoia and rage that came from living perpetually on the brink of exposure. Think about the psychological weight of never being able to relax, never being able to be genuinely yourself, always having to remember which lie you told to whom. Cunanan was caught between the dazzling heights of perceived success and the oppressive shadows of addiction and mounting desperation. His insatiable pursuit for more, whether money, recognition, or thrills, had become an addiction in itself. Despite his gifts and opportunities, Cunanan was falling short of his own impossible standards. The boy who dreamed of grand houses with sweeping ocean views was actually homeless, dependent entirely on the continued goodwill of others who were beginning to see through the facade. The question wasn't if this house of cards would collapse, but when, and what Cunanan would do when it finally did. What happens when a master manipulator loses control of his narrative? In Andrew Cunanan's case, the answer would prove catastrophic. By early 1997, the carefully balanced ecosystem of lies, relationships, and dependencies that had sustained his lifestyle for years was beginning to collapse. The transformation from charming socialite to cold-blooded killer didn't happen overnight, but when it began, it moved with terrifying speed. Between April 29th and July 15th, 1997, Cunanan would embark on a cross-country killing spree that defied every conventional understanding of serial murder. His first victim was Jeffrey Trail, someone he knew well, a close friend, which immediately set these killings apart from typical serial murders. This wasn't a stranger selected according to some twisted fantasy or pattern. This was personal, intimate, and devastating. The murder of someone who trusted him marked a fundamental shift in Cunanan's psychology. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return. But what made Cunanan particularly dangerous was how his crimes evolved. Unlike most serial killers who follow distinct patterns or leave signatures that represent deep-seated fantasies, Cunanan's murders were notably diverse in both method and motivation. His second victim, David Madsen, was another acquaintance whose disappearance sent alarm through their shared social circles. Then came Lee Miglin, a prominent real estate developer in Chicago, whom Cunanan presumably didn't know personally. This murder was particularly brutal, involving prolonged torture, mutilation, and binding. The level of violence suggested not just rage, but a complete psychological break from the charming socialite persona Cunanan had maintained for years. His fourth victim, William Reese in New Jersey, appeared to be killed primarily for utilitarian purposes. Cunanan needed his vehicle. This type of killing, sometimes termed serial functional, served a practical purpose rather than fulfilling a psychological fantasy. It demonstrated that Cunanan had become a predator of opportunity, capable of killing strangers simply to facilitate his escape. Now we arrive at the murder that would define Andrew Cunanan's legacy and capture the world's attention. July 15th, 1997, Miami Beach. Gianni Versace, the internationally celebrated fashion designer, made what would prove to be a fatal decision to personally collect his morning newspapers, a task usually handled by his assistant. Picture the scene: Versace's lavish mansion on Ocean Drive, the clear blue Miami sky, the peaceful morning routine of a man at the pinnacle of his creative powers. As Versace approached his grand entrance, newspapers in hand, Andrew Cunanan emerged from the shadows with chilling intent. Armed with a .40 caliber handgun, Cunanan shot Versace in the cheek without warning. The 50-year-old designer fell immediately, stunned by the unforeseen violence. But Cunanan wasn't finished. With cold calculation, he fired a second lethal shot into the back of Versace's head as he lay helpless on the ground. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution, carried out in broad daylight on the opulent steps of one of Miami's most recognizable residences. The sheer audacity of the act, killing one of the world's most recognizable fashion icons in such a public manner, shocked the global community and elevated Cunanan from regional fugitive to international headline. But what made this murder even more chilling was Cunanan's behavior afterward. Witnesses reported seeing him calmly walk away from the crime scene, seamlessly blending into the nearby streets. Despite having committed such a brazen act in broad daylight within an affluent neighborhood, he managed to avoid immediate capture. The assassination of Gianni Versace represented more than just another murder in Cunanan's spree. It was a statement. Whether driven by jealousy, rage, or a desperate desire for notoriety, Cunanan had chosen a victim whose death would guarantee him the attention he had always craved. The striking juxtaposition of the crime scene, where elegance met brutality on those mansion steps, amplified the atrocity's impact far beyond Miami Beach. In the aftermath of Versace's murder, America launched one of its most intensive manhunts of the 1990s. Andrew Cunanan's face was suddenly everywhere. Television screens, newspaper front pages, FBI wanted posters. He had achieved the notoriety he seemed to crave, but at an unthinkable cost. The investigation revealed the chilling scope of Cunanan's cross-country rampage. Hotel security cameras had captured footage of him hastily leaving the Versace crime scene. Witnesses reported seeing him enter a municipal parking garage shortly after the murder, where authorities discovered a pickup truck filled with clothes and Cunanan's passport, belongings connected to his New Jersey victim, William Reese, whom he had killed 6 weeks earlier. This discovery unraveled a complex trail of evidence stretching across multiple states. The truck was registered to Reese, whose murder scene revealed connections to the Chicago victim Lee Miglin through another stolen vehicle. Chicago police had already linked that case to the 2 Minnesota murders through additional ballistic and vehicle evidence. It was like following a deadly breadcrumb trail across America. Each murder had provided Cunanan with resources for the next: vehicles, money, time to plan, and travel. Unlike most serial killers who attempt to hide their crimes, Cunanan was living openly as a fugitive, embodying the characteristics of an outlaw on the run. The media coverage was relentless and unprecedented. 24-hour news cycles dissected every aspect of Cunanan's life, his victims' stories, and the ongoing investigation. The American public was simultaneously horrified and fascinated by this articulate, attractive young man who had committed such brutal acts. He represented something particularly disturbing, evil that didn't look like what people expected evil to look like. But even as his face became one of the most recognizable in America, Cunanan remained elusive. He was hiding in plain sight in Miami Beach, the very city where he had committed his most notorious crime. On July 23, 1997, just 8 days after the Versace assassination, the manhunt for Andrew Cunanan came to an abrupt and definitive end. A caretaker noticed signs of forced entry on a locked houseboat moored at Miami Beach, ironically not far from Versace's opulent mansion where the killing spree had reached its climax. The contrast was stark and symbolic. The man who had spent his life pursuing luxury and glamour was discovered in a small, unassuming vessel that represented everything his fabricated lifestyle had tried to escape. When police entered the houseboat, they found Cunanan's lifeless body, the result of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Nearby lay the .40 caliber handgun, the same caliber weapon used throughout his murder spree. With that single gunshot, Andrew Cunanan had chosen to end his story on his own terms, preventing any possibility of capture, trial, or the answers that so many desperately sought. The decision was characteristic of spree killers focused on evading justice, but it left a nation with more questions than answers. Robbins Thompson, one of Cunanan's friends, perhaps captured the essence of those final days best when he reflected, "I increasingly think he went on a suicide run. He could have turned back to Norman or others for help, but he was unwilling. It's as if he wanted to leave in a blaze of glory, like a rock star. Live fast, die young, stay pretty." Those words reveal the tragic core of Andrew Cunanan's psychology. Even in death, he was performing, creating one final dramatic scene that would cement his place in criminal history. The boy who had dreamed of grand houses with sweeping ocean views had ended up dying alone and hunted, accompanied only by a firearm and an overwhelming desire to evade capture. As we reach the end of our journey through Andrew Cunanan's story, it's important to step back and examine what his life and crimes reveal about the America of the 1990s. This wasn't just the story of one disturbed individual. It was a dark mirror reflecting broader cultural tensions and transformations happening across the country. Cunanan's narrative unfolded during a period when traditional social norms were loosening and new communities were emerging. The gay social circles he navigated were themselves existing in spaces between acceptance and marginalization, between visibility and discretion. His story illustrates how wealth, influence, and public image could conceal disturbing realities beneath polished exteriors. Each of his victims, excluding William Reese, represented different facets of Cunanan's fractured identity. Jeffrey Trail and David Madsen were connections to his authentic self, the friendships that might have anchored him to reality. Lee Miglin represented the wealthy, successful lifestyle he desperately craved. And Gianni Versace embodied the ultimate fusion of creativity, recognition, and international acclaim that Cunanan believed he deserved, but could never achieve through legitimate means. The murders weren't just acts of violence. They were symbolic destructions of the different paths his life might have taken, the different versions of himself he might have become if he had been capable of authentic connection rather than endless performance. Cunanan's story also reveals the particular dangers of a life built entirely on deception, the psychological toll of maintaining multiple identities, of never being able to truly connect with another human being, of constantly fearing exposure. These pressures create a powder keg of rage and desperation that eventually must find release. His substance abuse with crystal methamphetamine and cocaine wasn't separate from his criminal behavior. It was accelerant on an already dangerous situation, amplifying paranoia, reducing impulse control, and making increasingly extreme actions seem reasonable or necessary. As we close today's look at the Andrew Cunanan case, we're left with an unsettling truth. Some stories end without answers. Cunanan's suicide locked away many motivations, the final triggers, the private unraveling, leaving questions that haunt us. He was brilliant and charismatic, able to perform a life others admired, until those performances became instruments of harm. The 5 men he killed, Jeffrey Trail, David Madsen, Lee Miglin, William Reese, and Gianni Versace were real people with futures cut short. Cunanan's life is both cautionary and mysterious, a warning that charm can conceal deep damage, and that a life built on image can destroy itself. Want the full timeline, interviews, and the psychology behind each act? Download the Skoob app now to get access to the full story and exclusive bonus material. Thanks for listening. If you or someone you know is struggling, seek professional help.